The courtroom was already full when the doors opened that morning. The air carried a mix of tension and curiosity, the kind that makes people whisper quietly even when there's nothing to say. Reporters lined one side of the room, holding cameras that weren't supposed to record but somehow always did. On the other side, families sat shoulder to shoulder waiting for their turn to hear their names called. At the center of all this was a young man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were puffy, his shirt slightly wrinkled, and his hands shook just enough to give away what his face tried to hide. He stood beside a public defender who whispered instructions he barely heard. He just nodded, pretending to understand. He wasn't a criminal, not the way people on social media later made him out to be. He wasn't a hero either. He was just someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, someone who made a small mistake that ended up bigger than he could handle. The story that would soon circle the internet started long before that morning, but no one knew that yet. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. She was known for being strict but fair, someone who didn't let emotions steer her decisions. Her black robe flowed behind her as she took her seat. She glanced at the papers in front of her, then at the defendant. For a moment, their eyes met. A look so brief and ordinary that no one could have guessed it would later become part of a viral moment seen by millions. The first few minutes were standard procedure. Charges were read, rights were repeated, and the young man nodded through it all. But as the hearing continued, something in the tone of the exchange changed. His frustration, which he'd tried to bury, started to rise to the surface. It wasn't anger exactly, it was exhaustion, confusion, and fear all tangled together. He had already spent 3 nights in a holding cell, unable to post bail. He'd missed work, lost his paycheck, and didn't know how to explain any of it to his family. When the judge began questioning him about missing a previous court date, he tried to explain. His voice shook. The courtroom microphones caught every word. "Your Honor, I didn't mean to," he started. "Then why didn't you show up?" She interrupted, her tone sharp, professional. He hesitated. I had to take care of my mom. She's sick." "I didn't think." "You didn't think," she repeated, cutting him off again. "That's the problem." Those words hit him harder than they should have. He looked down at the table, his jaw tight. In that instant, someone in the audience pulled out a phone and started recording. It wasn't allowed, but no one stopped them. What happened next would become one of those short clips people share without ever asking what really happened. The young man raised his head, frustration breaking through his nervousness. His voice grew louder, and so did the tension in the room. "I said I didn't mean to miss it. I'm trying, okay?" The judge straightened, clearly surprised. The bailiff shifted his weight, ready to step forward if things escalated. "You need to calm down," she said firmly. "I'm calm. You don't even know what I'm going through," he replied. That was the moment, the one that would later become the clip. The camera caught his trembling voice, her composed expression, the silence that followed. 10 seconds of courtroom footage that would spread faster than anyone could control. In the video, it looked like a disrespectful outburst. It looked like a young man shouting at authority, like a judge putting someone in their place. But in reality, there was a pause after that moment. A long, quiet pause where both of them seemed to realize this wasn't just about rules or court schedules anymore. The judge looked at him differently then. Her voice softened slightly as she said, "I understand that you're going through a lot, but this isn't how we handle it." He swallowed hard and nodded, tears forming, but quickly blinked away. He mumbled, "I'm sorry." That part never made it into the video. The phone was lowered right after the dramatic outburst, long before anyone saw the apology or the judge's calmer response. The hearing ended shortly after, with the judge rescheduling the case and offering to review his bail. He was escorted out, confused but relieved that it hadn't gone worse. Outside, his public defender patted his shoulder and told him, "You did fine." He didn't feel fine. He felt exposed, embarrassed, and still unsure of what would happen next. That afternoon, someone uploaded the clip online. It was only 15 seconds long, cropped perfectly to make it look like a confrontation. The caption read, "Young man loses it in court. Judge shuts him down." Within hours, it spread across social media. People commented, shared, reacted. Some called him disrespectful. Others said the judge went too far. No one knew who he was, but everyone had an opinion. News channels picked it up the next morning, calling it the courtroom moment that shocked viewers. Memes appeared. Reaction videos followed. And soon everyone seemed to be talking about it. The young man didn't even know until a friend sent him a message saying, "Dude, you're on the internet." He didn't want to be. He never asked to be. But once a moment goes viral, it's no longer yours. It belongs to the world, and the world doesn't always care about the truth. That night, he stayed up scrolling through comments. Some were cruel, others were kind. But all of them felt like strangers deciding who he was without ever meeting him. One comment stuck in his mind. "This is what's wrong with people today. No respect," he wanted to reply, to explain, to tell them he wasn't disrespectful, that he'd just lost his job, that his mom was in the hospital, that he'd been scared. But what would be the point? No one listens to explanations once a story is already written for them. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, the judge sat in her office late that evening. A court clerk had shown her the viral video, and she watched it silently, the glow of the screen reflecting off her glasses. It was strange seeing herself through the lens of the internet. Her every expression frozen, analyzed, exaggerated. She knew how these things worked. One moment out of context could define someone for years. She thought about the young man, how he looked when he apologized, the way his voice cracked when he said sorry. None of that was online. None of it ever would be. The next day in court, things carried on as usual. The cases kept coming, the paperwork piled up, and life didn't pause for anyone's viral fame. But the judge couldn't shake the thought that the story was already out of her hands. People were arguing over her character, debating whether she was too harsh or too lenient, all based on a few seconds that didn't tell the full story. And somewhere across town, the young man sat in a small apartment, staring at his phone, wondering how a moment that lasted less than a minute could change how the world saw him. He didn't know what would happen next, whether people would forget in a week or if his name would keep floating around in conversations between strangers. All he knew was that the video didn't show what came before or after. It didn't show the tiredness in his eyes, the worry in his heart, or the simple truth that he never meant for any of it to happen. Outside, the city moved on. Cars honked, people hurried to work, and somewhere someone else was filming another moment that might go viral tomorrow. But inside that courtroom on that morning, two people had shared a brief, raw, human exchange, one that the internet would twist into something entirely different. And that was how it began. The real story wasn't about a shouting match or a judge's reaction. It was about what happens when a private moment becomes public, when fear looks like defiance, and when the world watches without ever knowing what it's truly seeing. The courtroom had emptied out hours ago, but if you stood there quietly, you could almost still hear the echo of his trembling voice, the rustle of papers, the sound of a judge trying to balance compassion and authority. It was just another day of justice being carried out. But for them, for both of them, it became the start of something neither could have imagined. The next morning, the world was already talking about him. He woke up to the sound of his phone vibrating again and again. At first he thought it was just messages from friends, maybe something about work or family. But when he opened his notifications, his stomach sank. His name was everywhere. There were comments, mentions, even a few news tags. Someone had found out his full name and posted it online. The 15-second video of him in the courtroom had been shared by pages that normally posted funny clips. But this one wasn't funny. It was him, nervous, scared, raising his voice for a few seconds, now turned into a public spectacle. He watched the video once, then again, then again. It didn't even sound like him. The way his voice cracked, the angle of the camera, the freeze frame that made him look angry instead of anxious. It all felt like a stranger he didn't recognize. He scrolled through the comments, reading words that cut deeper than they should have. Another disrespectful kid who thinks he's above the law. This is what's wrong with the system. No respect for authority. Someone needs to teach him a lesson. A few people tried to defend him, saying things like, "You can tell he's just scared," or "This feels sad." Not funny. But their voices were buried under the noise. He shut off his phone and just sat there staring at the wall. His mother, resting on the couch across the room, didn't know yet. He didn't have the heart to tell her. She was still recovering, and the last thing she needed was to see her son become a viral headline. For the rest of the day, he tried to stay off social media. He went for a walk, keeping his head down, but it didn't help. People at the bus stop were showing each other something on their phones, laughing. He couldn't help but wonder if it was his video again. Across town in the courthouse, The judge's assistant knocked softly on her office door. "Ma'am, you've probably already seen this," the assistant said, holding out a phone. The judge looked up from her paperwork. "Seen what?" The assistant hesitated. "The clip from yesterday. It's online. A lot of people are talking about it." The judge sighed quietly, took the phone, and watched. She didn't react at first. Her face stayed calm, but her eyes shifted slightly as the clip played. It was short and only a few seconds, and it made her look cold. She knew that wasn't the full story, but she also knew it didn't matter now. When she finished watching, she handed the phone back and said simply, "Thank you. That'll be all." The rest of her day went on as usual, but it felt different. Every time she spoke to someone in the courtroom, she wondered if they had seen the clip too. If they were judging her for it. If they thought she was heartless. Later that evening, she sat in her car before driving home, the sun setting behind the courthouse. She thought about the young man again, how he looked when he said sorry. She remembered the tremor in his voice, the way his hands gripped the edge of the table like he was holding on to the last bit of strength he had left. None of that was in the video. None of it ever would be. She had spent years on the bench seeing hundreds of cases, some tragic, some frustrating, all of them human. But this one stayed in her mind. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the way the world had decided to turn something real into entertainment. Meanwhile, the young man's phone kept buzzing. Someone had tagged him in a new post. A news outlet had picked up the story. They called it the courtroom outburst everyone's talking about. They didn't use his full name, but it didn't matter. People found him anyway. He started getting messages from strangers. Some said they understood. Others weren't so kind. One said, "Hope the judge gives you double next time." Another said, "Keep your head up, man. We all make mistakes." He didn't know how to respond. Every time he tried to type something, he deleted it. How do you explain a story that everyone thinks they already know? By the end of the week, his job called. They'd seen the video too. They didn't say much, just that they were reevaluating his position. It didn't matter that he hadn't done anything violent or wrong. The image of him shouting in a courtroom was enough to make them nervous. He felt like his whole life had shrunk down to 15 seconds of misunderstanding. Days passed, but the clip didn't fade away. It spread to more pages, even got used in a few compilation videos with dramatic music and exaggerated titles. People who had never seen his face before now debated his character like he was a movie character. And yet, somewhere in the noise, a few people started asking questions. A local journalist decided to dig deeper. She found out what case it really was, a minor charge, a missed court date, nothing serious. She contacted him for an interview, but he refused at first. He didn't trust the media anymore. Eventually, though, after a long talk with his mother, he agreed to meet her in a quiet cafe. He looked nervous, his hands clasped tightly together as he spoke. "Everyone thinks they know what happened," he said softly. "They don't know I was just scared. I didn't even realize someone was filming. I wasn't trying to disrespect her. I just..." Snapped for a second. The reporter listened carefully, not interrupting. When he finished, she asked, "Did the judge say anything to you after the hearing?" He thought for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "After court, when I was being let out, she called me back. She told me to take care of myself and come back on the new date." She didn't yell. She actually sounded kind. The reporter nodded, jotting down notes. That detail never appeared anywhere online. But she wrote her article honestly. No dramatic title, no exaggerations. Just the truth. Viral courtroom moment, the real story behind the clip. When the story went live, it didn't explode like the video had, but it started to change things quietly. A few people who had once mocked him now apologized in the comments. Some said they hadn't realized how short the clip was or how much context had been cut out. The judge read that article too. It appeared on her desk one morning, printed and left by someone anonymously. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in her drawer. For the first time in days, she smiled. Not because she enjoyed the attention, but because someone had finally seen the full picture. Still, the young man's life didn't return to normal overnight. People at the grocery store recognized him. Some gave him sympathetic looks, others judgmental ones. He started wearing a cap when he went out, hoping to avoid being noticed. But slowly, as the internet found new things to talk about, the noise faded. The views stopped climbing. The comments slowed down. The clip was still out there, but people had moved on. One evening, about 2 weeks later, he received a letter in the mail. It was from the courthouse. For a moment, his heart raced. He thought it was another notice or a fine. But when he opened it, he saw something unexpected. It was a note from the judge. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, handwritten on official letterhead. She wrote that she understood how overwhelming the situation must have been and hoped he was taking care of himself. She reminded him to appear for his next court date and encouraged him not to let the noise of the internet define him. He read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it into a drawer, the same way she had with the article. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept peacefully. It was strange how one moment could turn the world upside down, and another small act of kindness could start to turn it right again. The viral video was still online, still out there, but now, behind it, there were real people. A young man who had been misunderstood and a judge who had been misjudged. 2 human beings trying in their own quiet ways to handle the storm that the internet had created. And though neither of them knew it yet, their paths were about to cross again, not in anger this time, but in a way that would remind both of them, and everyone watching, that the truth can't always be captured in a clip. A week after the judge's handwritten note arrived, the young man thought things were finally starting to quiet down. The worst of the storm had passed, or so it seemed. The clip wasn't everywhere anymore. His phone buzzed less. He was trying to piece his life back together, one small step at a time. He spent most of his mornings helping his mother around the house and looking for new work. He still avoided going out much, still kept his head down on the bus, but at least the knot in his chest had loosened a little. He thought maybe people were beginning to forget. Then one morning, his public defender called. "Hey," the voice said gently. "Have you seen the full courtroom video?" He froze. "What do you mean, the full one?" "The court's surveillance footage was released officially," the defender said. "The whole hearing, start to finish. Some local journalist filed a request to see it. It's been posted by a news channel." He didn't know what to say. His first thought was fear. More video meant more people watching him, more comments, more noise. But the lawyer continued. "It actually shows what really happened. You might want to take a look." He hesitated for hours before pressing play. When he finally did, he sat in silence as the video began. This time it wasn't cropped. There were no jump cuts or captions or dramatic music, just the dull hum of a courtroom microphone, the shuffle of papers, and the quiet, heavy breathing of someone trying to hold it together. The video started with the judge walking in and the young man standing nervously beside his lawyer. It showed the beginning, where he'd been polite, soft-spoken, trying to explain. It showed how the conversation slowly grew tense, how his voice cracked, not from anger but from panic. And most importantly, it showed what came after the outburst, the silence, the apology, the judge's calm response, and the moment she gently reminded him to take care of his mother. It showed the truth. The news channel posted it with the headline, "Full video reveals what the viral clip missed." Unlike the first one, this clip didn't explode overnight. But those who watched it began to see things differently. Comments started changing. People who had been angry before now wrote things like, "Wow, this hits different when you see the full video." He wasn't disrespectful at all. He was scared. The judge actually handled that really well. The young man scrolled through the comments quietly, his eyes stinging. He hadn't expected anyone to care about the truth. For the first time, it felt like maybe they finally saw him, not as a headline, but as a person. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, the judge read the same article. She watched the full video too. The courtroom's security footage had always been there, but no one had bothered to look until now. Watching it again, she noticed things she hadn't in the moment. The tremor in his hands, the way he blinked fast to keep from crying, the way the bailiff had shifted forward, tense, ready to intervene. She sighed and leaned back in her chair. All this, she whispered to herself, over 10 seconds. Later that day, she held a meeting with her staff. "If anyone asks," she said, "we'll let the video speak for itself. No interviews, no statements. The truth's already out there." Her assistant nodded. People seemed to be realizing it wasn't how it looked. The judge smiled faintly. Maybe that's enough. Across town, the young man was finally able to breathe. For the first time in weeks, he felt like the world wasn't against him. He even turned his phone back on and stopped flinching every time it buzzed. But it wasn't all peace. The internet had a strange way of keeping things alive even when the story changed. Some pages reposted the full video with sarcastic captions. Others refused to take down the old clip. There were still people who didn't care about context. They just wanted something to argue about. Still, the shift was happening, quietly but steadily. A local radio host did a small segment titled Viral Moments and Missing Truths, using his story as an example. Teachers used it to talk about online responsibility. Even a few bloggers who had mocked him earlier apologized publicly, admitting they'd been too quick to judge. And somewhere in all of this, something else began to change inside him. For weeks, he'd been hiding from the world, afraid of being seen. Now he started to feel something new: courage. He realized that if the internet could twist a story, maybe it could also help tell the real one. A community organization reached out, asking if he'd be willing to speak about what happened, not as a victim, but as someone who had seen firsthand how fast a story can spread without truth. He hesitated at first, but after talking it over with his mother, he agreed. When he arrived at the community center, a small crowd had gathered: students, parents, teachers, even a few reporters. He wasn't used to speaking in front of people, but when he stood at the podium and looked out, something in him settled. He began softly. "I never planned for my face to end up online. I was scared, tired, and confused. I made a mistake, not a crime, not an act of disrespect, just a human mistake." The room was quiet. Everyone listened. "I learned something," he continued. "A few seconds of video can make you look like someone you're not. But the truth always has a way of showing up, even if it takes time." When he finished, people clapped, not because it was a dramatic speech, but because it was honest. The judge, sitting quietly in the back row, smiled to herself. She hadn't told him she was coming. She just wanted to listen. After the talk, she approached him privately. He looked surprised to see her, but managed a small smile. "Your speech was brave," she said. "I'm glad you're using this to help others." "Thank you, ma'am," he replied quietly. "And thank you for not giving up on me." They shook hands. No cameras, no audience, no performance. Just a quiet moment between two people who had both been misunderstood. Later that evening, as he walked home, the air felt lighter. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, and for the first time, he felt like himself again. Not the boy from the viral video, not the internet's mistake, but just a person trying to move forward. The full video continued to spread slowly, finding its way into classrooms, discussions, and podcasts. It became an example of how stories can change when you take the time to listen. But even as people moved on, the young man never forgot what it felt like to be judged by millions for something no one truly understood. He carried that lesson with him quietly, like a reminder of both pain and growth. One afternoon, weeks later, he returned to the courthouse for his rescheduled hearing. The same judge presided over the session, though this time there were no cameras, no whispers, no crowd waiting to film a moment. When his case was called, he stood confidently, answering every question clearly. The hearing was short and calm. When it ended, the judge smiled slightly and said, "I'm glad to see you here today." He smiled back. "I wasn't going to miss it this time." The room filled with quiet laughter. Even the bailiff cracked a grin. As he walked out of the courtroom, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The internet might forget, people might move on, but for him, the experience had changed everything. It taught him that a moment doesn't define a person, that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard, and that sometimes the world only sees what fits inside a screen, but real life happens outside of it. Later that night, he sat with his mother, the TV humming softly in the background. The same news station that once ran the viral clip now ran a follow-up story about the full footage. The headline read, "From Viral Controversy to Redemption." His mother turned to him and smiled. "See," she said softly, "people are starting to see who you really are." He nodded, feeling tears rise, but not from sadness this time. "Yeah," he whispered, "they are." Outside, the city buzzed as always, but for the first time since that morning in court, he felt free from the weight of other people's opinions. The story wasn't over yet. Not for him, not for the judge, not for anyone who had learned something from it. Because the truth, once seen, never disappears. And that was what made this story different. It wasn't about who shouted or who was right. It was about what happens after. when the world slows down, when the noise fades, and when two people on opposite sides of a courtroom finally see each other as human beings. When the full courtroom video began circulating, the noise on social media slowly shifted. What had started as a flood of criticism turned into something else. Questions, debates, even apologies. People began saying they'd learned a lesson about judging too fast. News shows used clips of the young man's speech from the community center to talk about second chances. For a while, he watched it all happen from the sidelines. Every few days, a reporter called asking for interviews. A podcast wanted him to share his story live. He said no to most of them. He didn't want fame. He just wanted his life back. But the story kept finding him anyway. A high school teacher reached out saying her students had watched his full video as part of a media literacy lesson. Another message came from a small town halfway across the country. A single father wrote, "My son saw your talk. He's been in trouble before and it gave him hope." The messages warmed him. For the first time, the attention didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like purpose. He spent his days quietly helping at a neighborhood youth center, fixing chairs, cleaning up after events, sometimes speaking to small groups about what had happened. He never called himself an activist, but people began inviting him to more gatherings. "Just tell them what you told me," the organizer would say. And he did, honestly, simply, without trying to sound perfect. He told them how fear had made him raise his voice, how one short video had erased everything else about him, and how forgiveness from one person, a judge, of all people, had helped him see that mistakes don't have to be permanent. Meanwhile, in her quiet office at the courthouse, the judge followed the story from afar. Her staff often mentioned how the case had turned into a positive example. She'd nod politely, but she rarely joined in. She wasn't looking for attention either. Still, she couldn't ignore how much things had changed around her. Lawyers she worked with began talking about context more often. Even in other hearings, when a defendant became emotional, the atmosphere was different. A little more patient, a little less rigid. She noticed it and felt quietly proud. One afternoon, she was invited to a legal ethics panel at a nearby university. The topic, viral justice, how social media shapes public perception of the courts. Normally, she avoided public events, but this one felt important. When the day came, she stood at the podium and looked out at the students. "Every day," she said, "we make decisions that affect real people. Cameras don't always show what leads up to those moments, or what happens after. That's why we must remember that justice is not just rules on paper. It's people." The audience applauded quietly, thoughtfully. Later, a student asked if she knew what had happened to the young man from the video. She smiled softly. "Yes," she said. "He's doing well." Across town, that same young man was at the youth center, painting a mural with a group of kids. Bright colors covered the wall, blues, yellows, reds, forming the image of a sunrise over a city skyline. Above it, in careful letters, they wrote, "One moment doesn't define you." He didn't plan the words. One of the kids suggested them. But when he stepped back to look at the finished mural, he realized they summed up everything he'd learned. A few days later, a journalist who had followed his story since the beginning asked if he'd meet the judge again, this time on camera, for a short documentary about the power of perspective. He hesitated at first. He didn't want to turn a private connection into entertainment. But after thinking it through, he agreed on one condition. "No drama," he said. "Just honesty." The meeting took place in a small, sunlit courtroom, empty except for a couple of chairs, a camera, and a quiet film crew. When the judge walked in, she gave him a genuine smile. "It's good to see you again," she said. "You too, ma'am," he replied, shaking her hand. The interviewer asked simple questions at first, what they remembered about that day, how they felt afterward. Their answers were calm, reflective. "I think we both learned something," the judge said, "about patience, about empathy, about how quickly things can be misunderstood." He nodded. "And about how forgiving someone can change everything." When the short film aired online, it wasn't sensational. There were no arguments, no viral-style editing. Just two people sitting across from each other, talking like old friends about a mistake that had turned into a lesson. Viewers loved it, not because it was exciting, but because it was real. Comments poured in. "This made me tear up." Finally, a story that ends with understanding. We need more moments like this. Within days, schools and community groups started using the documentary as a teaching tool. News outlets revisited the case, this time focusing on redemption rather than controversy. The young man's life quietly stabilized. He found steady work again, part-time at first, then full-time. The youth center asked him to stay on as a mentor. Kids looked up to him now, not because he was perfect, but because he was proof that people could change the story others tell about them. As for the judge, she continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose. Sometimes, after court, she'd sit in her chambers and think about how differently things could have turned out if either of them had reacted just a little worse that morning. It reminded her that the smallest gestures, a softer tone, a second chance, could ripple outward farther than any verdict. Months later, the city hosted a civic service award ceremony. The young man was surprised to find his name on the list of honorees for community resilience. When he went up to accept the plaque, he didn't give a long speech. He just said, "This belongs to everyone who ever felt misunderstood and kept trying anyway." In the audience, the judge clapped quietly. She didn't want recognition. Just seeing him there, smiling, was enough. After the ceremony, they spoke briefly outside. The evening air was cool and city lights blinked across the skyline. He said, "You know, I used to wish that video never happened." She looked thoughtful. "And now?" He smiled. "Now I think maybe it needed to." She nodded. Sometimes the hardest moments are the ones that wake people up. They parted with a simple goodbye. No cameras, no headlines, just peace. Over time, the story found its way into podcasts, short documentaries, even classroom discussions about media literacy. But unlike most viral stories, this one didn't fade into bitterness or blame. It became something gentler, a reminder of empathy in a world that often forgets to slow down. People who'd shared the original angry clip years later found themselves saying, "Remember that courtroom story?" Turns out it ended beautifully, and it did. The judge continued her work until retirement, mentoring younger judges about balancing authority with compassion. The young man went on to study social work, hoping to help others who felt trapped by judgment and misunderstanding. Sometimes he still got recognized, not for the outburst, but for what came after. "Hey," strangers would say kindly, "you're that guy who turned things around, right?" He'd nod, smile, and answer, "Yeah, that was me." But really, it was all of us. Because the story had grown beyond him now. It wasn't just about a single courtroom or a single mistake. It was about everyone who had ever been seen in a moment of weakness and wished the world would wait long enough to understand. The internet moved on to other stories, other clips, other headlines, but somewhere in the quiet corners of the web, the full video remained, still being watched by people who wanted to see what real humanity looked like. And each time someone pressed play, they saw not anger or disrespect, but something else. Two people, tired and human, doing their best to meet in the middle. Time moved quietly after the storm faded. Months turned into a year, and the viral courtroom moment that once filled every screen slowly became just another piece of internet history. New videos appeared, new debates started, and people found new things to argue about. But for the young man at the center of it all, life had changed in a lasting way. He had learned to live at a slower pace. Every morning, he helped open the doors of the youth center, greeting kids who came in for tutoring, basketball, or just a safe place to be. He never told them his whole story unless they asked, but some already knew. A few had seen the clip back when it was everywhere. One day, a teenager stayed behind after everyone left. He looked uneasy, hands buried in his hoodie pockets. "You're that guy, right?" he asked quietly. The young man nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "That was me." The kid hesitated. "Everyone made fun of you back then, but you didn't let it ruin your life." He smiled. "It almost did," he admitted. "But I realized one bad moment doesn't have to be your whole story." The boy nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing. That small conversation was one of dozens he would have over the next year. Small, private talks that no camera could ever capture, but that mattered far more than the viral fame ever had. Meanwhile, the judge continued her work quietly. She'd gained a new reputation in the courthouse, not as the strict judge, but as the one who truly listened. Lawyers said her courtroom felt different now, calmer somehow. She still upheld the law firmly, but there was something gentler about the way she spoke, especially when dealing with first-time offenders or nervous young defendants. Her staff noticed too. One clerk once said, "Ma'am, you've changed." The judge had smiled. Maybe I just started seeing things a little clearer. Outside of work, she'd been invited to give guest lectures about the importance of humanity in the justice system. She didn't mention the viral moment often, but when she did, it was never with regret. That day reminded me that every case is a story, she'd tell her audience, and we only ever see a few pages of it at a time. One evening, nearly 2 years after the viral clip, the youth center organized a small celebration for its volunteers. The young man didn't know it yet, but they planned to honor him for his dedication. The kids made a banner that said, "Thank you for believing in us." He laughed when he saw it. "You guys did all the hard work," he said. During the ceremony, the director handed him a simple plaque. Nothing fancy, just a wooden base with his name and the words, "For turning lessons into light." He looked out at the crowd, the kids, the parents, the neighbors, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. Later that night, as everyone began leaving, a familiar voice called from behind. "I thought I'd stop by," the judge said, smiling as she stepped inside. He looked surprised but happy. "You came all this way?" "I heard you were being recognized," she said. "I couldn't miss it." They sat down in the quiet hall after most people had gone. The lights were dim, and the mural he'd helped paint months earlier, the one that said, "One moment doesn't define you," stretched across the wall beside them. He looked at it, then at her. Funny how that line ended up meaning everything. She nodded. "It's true. People forget that when they're behind a screen." They talked for a while. About life, about second chances, about how strange it was that something so painful had turned into something good. He said, "You know, at first I used to hate that video. I wanted it gone forever, but now, maybe I'm glad it exists. It taught me more about people than anything else." She smiled softly. The internet sees moments. Real life sees people. That's the difference. They sat quietly after that, just listening to the soft hum of the lights and the faint sound of laughter from the kids still outside. It was peaceful. Not the kind of peace that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from forgiving. As months passed, their lives went on. The young man began studying part-time, focusing on social work. He wanted to help others who'd been misunderstood or labeled by a single moment. It wasn't easy. Between work, school, and volunteering, his days were full, but he didn't mind. Sometimes people still recognized him from the old video. It happened less often now, but when it did, the reaction was always different. Once, a woman approached him in a grocery store and said, "I showed your story to my son. It helped him understand that even when you mess up, you can start over." He thanked her quietly, smiling to himself as he walked away. It still felt strange that something so painful had helped others heal, but maybe that was how the world worked sometimes. As for the judge, she eventually retired after years of service. Her farewell gathering was small and warm. Co-workers, a few close friends, and some of the people whose lives she'd quietly helped along the way. Among the guests was the young man, older now, more confident, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. When he handed them to her, she laughed softly. "You didn't have to bring these." "I did," he said. "You changed my life." She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "You changed your own. I just gave you a chance." There was a pause, one of those moments that didn't need words. Then they both smiled. Two people who had started out on opposite sides of a courtroom, but ended up as proof that understanding can outlast judgment. A few months later, a local newspaper ran a small feature titled, "The Viral Moment That Made a Difference." It wasn't sensational or dramatic. It simply told their story, how a misunderstanding turned into redemption, how kindness reshaped a narrative that once divided people. It ended with a line that read, "In a world full of quick opinions, sometimes the most powerful act is to pause and listen." The article didn't go viral. It didn't need to. The people who needed to see it found it quietly. Teachers, parents, young readers who had grown up on social media. For them, it was a reminder that behind every trending video, there's a heartbeat, a story, and a chance for compassion. Years later, when the young man walked past the courthouse where it had all started, he stopped for a moment. The building looked smaller now, the way places from the past often do. He stood on the same steps where cameras had once pointed at him and took a deep breath. Years later, the world had changed again. Technology was faster, attention spans shorter, and yet every so often old stories found their way back into the light. One evening, a short video began to circulate online. It wasn't new, but it had resurfaced in a new form. It showed a montage, the viral courtroom clip, followed by scenes from the documentary, the mural at the youth center, and the quote that had stayed with so many people. One moment doesn't define you. Someone had re-edited it with soft piano music and posted it with the caption, "When empathy wins." This time the comments were different. There was no outrage, no quick judgment, just reflection. People shared their own stories of being misunderstood, of being given a second chance. It became a quiet movement, not loud or trendy, but heartfelt. The young man, now in his late 30s, found out about it when one of the kids he mentored, now an adult himself, sent him the link. "Hey," the message read, "you're going viral again, but in the good way this time." He smiled when he saw it. The video had millions of views, but he didn't feel the same rush or fear as before. He felt peace, because now the world wasn't laughing or judging. It was listening. He watched for a few moments, then turned off his phone and went back to his desk, where papers and notebooks were spread out. He was working on a small book, part memoir, part reflection, about everything he'd learned since that day. The title was simple, More Than a Moment. He didn't plan to make it a big release. He just wanted to write it for the people who needed to hear that life could start over, even after public mistakes. Each page came slowly, but with honesty. He wrote about shame, forgiveness, and the power of patience. He wrote about the judge who saw beyond the surface, and how that single act had shaped every good thing that came after. He even wrote a letter to her inside the book. "You once told me justice is about people, not just rules." That line became the foundation of my life's work. Wherever you are, thank you for reminding me that I was still worth seeing. Across the coast, the judge's health had begun to slow with age. Her walks along the boardwalk were shorter now, but she still took them. She often carried a small notebook where she wrote thoughts and reflections from her years on the bench. One day her daughter brought her a package. "Someone sent you this," she said. Placing it on the table, it was a book, More Than a Moment. Inside, on the first page, was a handwritten note. "For the one who taught me that mercy can be stronger than judgment." She read the entire book that night. Every page brought back memories she hadn't revisited in years. The tense courtroom, the chaos that followed, and the quiet transformation that came after. When she finished, she closed the book and sat in silence for a long time. Then she smiled, whispering softly, "He found his way." The next morning, she wrote a letter in return. Her handwriting was slower now, but her words were steady. "You've done what few people ever manage, and you've turned a painful moment into a lifelong purpose. I don't need to tell you how proud I am. The world is better because you didn't give up on yourself. With gratitude, always, the judge." She mailed the letter to the address listed on the back of the book, never knowing if it would reach him. It did. When the young man received it, he opened it carefully as if afraid the words might disappear. He read it twice, then 3 times, and each time he felt the same quiet warmth spread through him. He set the letter on his desk beside his framed plaque from the youth center. For a long time, he just stared at both, one a symbol of community, the other of compassion. Realizing that they told the same story in different ways, he decided to dedicate the book's earnings to a small scholarship fund for young people who had made mistakes but wanted to start fresh. He called it the Second Page Fund. It started small, a few local sponsors, some donations from readers, but it grew steadily. Within a couple of years, the fund was helping students in multiple cities. Some studied law, some studied counseling, some just wanted to finish school and rebuild. Every applicant had to write one essay. Describe a moment that almost defined you, and how you changed the story. Reading those essays became one of his favorite things. They reminded him of how far he had come, and how much hope there still was in the world. A few years later, the judge passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her family found her notebook beside her bed, open to the last page. The final line she had written read, "Kindness is not a ruling. It's a choice." At her memorial, one of her former clerks mentioned how her courtroom had changed people's lives, not through leniency, but through humanity. A few weeks after her passing, the young man was invited to speak at a tribute event in her honor. Standing at the podium, he looked out at the room filled with judges, lawyers, students, and community leaders. He took a deep breath and began, "I once stood in front of this woman on one of the worst days of my life. She could have written me off like so many others did, but instead she saw me, not as a headline, not as a case number, but as a person." He paused, voice steady but soft. "She taught me that justice can be firm and still have a heart. Because of her, I found my purpose. And because of that, I've seen hundreds of others find theirs." When he finished, the room stood in silence for a moment before gentle applause began. Some people wiped tears. After the event, as he stepped outside, the cool air felt like a reminder, not of loss but of continuity. He whispered quietly, "Thank you, ma'am, for everything." Years continued to pass. The scholarship grew into a foundation. The youth center expanded, and one of its walls carried a new mural, the same sunrise as before but with new words beneath it. "Mercy is a mirror. What you give reflects back." The young man, now older with streaks of gray in his hair, would often stand by that wall and smile. Sometimes when new volunteers asked about the mural's story, he'd tell them. Other times he'd simply say, "It's about a judge who believed in people." And every time, the message landed. Because even though the world had changed, even though news stories had taken the internet by storm, this one kept quietly living on, passed from person to person like a small light that never went out. In the end, it was never about a viral clip or a single courtroom. It was about what happens when someone chooses understanding over anger. It was about second chances, quiet bravery, and the ripple effect of one kind act. And somewhere, in the hearts of the people who heard it, students, parents, teachers, judges, and kids, that truth kept growing. That we are never just the worst thing we've done. That a moment can change a life, not through shame, but through compassion, and that even after the noise fades, kindness keeps echoing. Always.